It is a big thing to talk about the whole West Coast. And there's a lot of peculiar things because it's so different. But I want to preface this by the reality. It's estimated that prior to contact, the 1600s with Spanish, there were over 1 million people in California. And then by the late 1700s, that had been reduced to 300,000. And by 1900, there were probably less than 15,000. So California changed geographically, topologically, and demographically so quickly, faster than any other part of the United States. And in fact, this was underwritten by the state legislature. They appropriated in the 1850s $1.33 million to pay for bounties on any native Californian killed, whatever the reason. Well, the reason was they stood in the way of progress. They owned the land that people wanted. They interfered with mining and so on. So 25 cents per scalp or $5 for a whole head. And the Army was very active in this, and those heads were sent back to the Smithsonian. So it's a pretty sad commentary that is not well known. And you may remember that in June a year ago, our governor actually finally apologized. It was symbolic, but nonetheless, it was a very important event. Apologized for the genocide, which is actually what it was. There are some new books about this genocide and what went on. It is not a pretty story, and it's a story that's never told in any way, shape, or form. And this continues. In the 1970s, Native women across the United States were legally sterilized for no other reason than they tended to have more children than was normal. So if they were in a school situation or on a reservation, they could be sterilized. They may go in for a tonsillectomy, but come out sterile. I love this picture. Well, I hate it, but I love it in the sense what a repeating rifle can do, but also as the buffalo go, so go the Indians. And these are all buffalo heads that eventually became fertilizer. I want you to think, we're talking about what is sacred to Native Americans and what is the religion of Native Americans. And what if your thoughts and actions determine the balance of the universe? If you didn't sing and dance, the salmon may not come back, or the sun may not rise. If you weren't respectful of animals and offer them things, you may never hunt again. How you acted to other people was how the cosmos and other people treated you. I know you might say, this really sounds Christian, but if you think about it, no, this is native animism, trying to keep the world as it is, to walk in beauty, to make sure the world is in balance. It's not about your future life. That's a given. And this is a big difference between Christianity. And the other thing is that everything has spirit. Your ancestors are still near you. And your relationship with all the spirits of the cosmos is crucial. I actually want to start to the north. What if your whole land was your church? And anything on that land could be sacred or could be desecrated. So I want to talk about this beach, which is an amazing beach. It's a little tiny island. Some of you know it, the Queen Charlotte Island up here. It's actually called Haida Gwaii in the Haida. And here is a spit, the very northern spit, and it has a really low tide. And one day Raven was walking along there, heard a little bit of kind of pleading sounds like it was a seagull. And he went over and he found a clam, and he pecked at the clam, opened it up a little bit, and it was filled with people. And they pleaded with him, and he finally opened the clam and let all the people out. So think about that. All of your descendants came from this beach, which is on the north part of this island, and the whole thing is sacred to you. This is Bill Reed, Haida, who did this remarkable, incredible sculpture, which is in the British Columbia Museum of Anthropology. If you ever get on to Vancouver, it is an amazing thing. It's a little bit far away from the downtown, but uh, the entire museum exhibits our holdings are on display, and this is there. Raven is the creator for Haida and Tlingit people. In fact, all of the Northwest Coast Indians are a moiety. They either are descendant from a Raven clan or a bald eagle clan. Now, I know this is a little far-fetched. It's still the West Coast, but think about this. What if you had a giant party, could spend all your money on food and invited everybody you knew and bought presents for everyone, and then spent 4 days or 5 days dancing, eating, and then you gave it all away. And then to show how good you were and how loving and caring, you burned your house down. Of course, Christians would outlaw that. What is more unchristian than not protecting your ownings? But this was the potlatch tradition, and it was outlawed both in the United States and in Canada. And not until very recently was it allowed to be held again. This is a village, and it's one of the, to me, one of the most sacred, moving villages I've ever been to. This is Ninstons, which was just simply abandoned on Queen Charlotte Islands. But you have an intense feeling that this is loaded with ancestors, and every one of the totems have the spirit of the ancestors. And they just leave it and let it all decay, which is the natural thing for a totem. And there are petroglyphs around, and many of the Haidas still visit these and give offerings to their ancestors and other spirits. There are waterfalls, and often these waterfalls are a place that spirits gather, and they're littered with petroglyphs. Now, I can't talk about all these places, but you can look at them. And an interesting thing about, of course, the West Coast is our remarkable Cascade Range and the Sierra Nevada Range, and all of these mountains are sacred to the local groups. So I don't need to talk about them. Fortunately, by default, many of these were protected by the Forest Service or the National Park Service, but not completely. They're only protected in the sense that they can be logged and so on. And we take it for granted that sacred spots should be protected, but it is a constant battle. For instance, a few years ago, there was a federal ruling to allow tours, commercial tours onto Rattlesnake Mountain up in Washington. This is like, okay, if you've ever been to the Holy Land, when you try to get into the place that Jesus was supposedly born, you can't get in there until all three religions agree on when they're done with their service and when you can go down into the basement or whatever it is. And it's ridiculous. People fighting over access. Well, you imagine having tours through that. Water is sacred. Recently, the Snoqualmie people bought a falls for $125 million. That's how sacred it is to them. They didn't want it developed anymore commercially. And this is a big commercial development, but they bought that too, so they can interpret their religion and their belief. And this is happening over and over again. It's the only option that Native peoples have. The Navajos recently bought a part of their sacred mountain in New Mexico for several $1 million to try to preserve it because the Forest Service isn't doing it. Palouse Falls. Waterfalls make people feel good, probably because of the negative ions, and it's just mesmerizing. It's like the world's biggest shower. You love to stare at it. It's a place that many spirits gather, the spirit of the earth, the spirit of the moving water. This one, fortunately, is protected. And the Colville group, which is a group of Indians, have one of the largest reservations. There aren't many reservations on the West Coast just because the people were exterminated so rapidly. It was less so in Washington and then less so in Oregon, but there are very few reservations. This is one of the largest one, and they're very active politically. They were involved in the Snoqualmie Falls, even though they're quite a ways from that. They have a nice visitor center too. And they also oversee, sadly, the Columbia River petroglyphs, which are among the most remarkable. They're on the Washington side of the Columbia River. With one of the dams, they had to relocate these. So they blasted all these pieces out and then brought them up and put them on display. This is a very famous one, She Who Watches. It's actually a bare figure, but everyone thinks it's your mother or grandmother watching you. So this is where the display is, and these are all pieces that were removed from the river before it got flooded. It's a remarkable spot. People still hold ceremonies. 3 or 4 rivers, tribes come to the river repeatedly during solstice and other celebrations. Some of you have heard about the Kennewick Man. This was a skeleton found sticking out of the banks of the Columbia River in 1996. It was dated then at 9,000 years. It's been a little bit more accurately dated. It was reconstructed, and people thought it looked like Patrick Stewart. I think that's his name, one of the commanders of the Starship Enterprise. No, he actually is Native American. A long battle ensued until he was returned under a law called the Native American Graves and Protection Repatriation Act. It's a big mouthful, but it allows skeletons and artifacts to be returned. In fact, they say they should be returned. So after about a 20-year battle, he was returned, buried at an unknown place, and a confederation from Umatilla, Yakima, Nez Perce, and the Colville and others were involved in the repatriation. And this happens periodically. The Department of Interior says they've returned 50,000 skeletal remains, whatever that means, bones, and they get buried. Likewise, the Anzac child, which is an incredibly important child, which is the oldest human in the United States found, and it's an infant, and the DNA shows that it was clearly Asian in origins, which a lot of my Indian friends don't believe, just because they all know where they came from, some mountain or some hole in the ground or some other deity they didn't walk across. So it's interesting to have these discussions. But the child was actually returned to this woman who actually owned the ranch where the skeleton was found. And then the tribes got together, reburied the infant. And the spirit mummy, which is one of the oldest, dated at 9,000 years old, which was found actually partially mummified in a cave in Nevada. Very important archaeologically, but eventually was returned in 2016. The battle over skeletal remains is still a very, very important thing. And not only the skeletons, but artifacts that come up. Recently, two pieces were shown on Antiques Roadshow, or Roadshow, whatever it is. And people up in Alaska noticed that those were things that went missing in the early 1900s. And of course, trying to contact people was impossible. And also some of the Indian tribes have noticed they have people watching auctions in Paris and London, and they end up buying things back. Oregon, of course, has its sacred mountains. This one being Mount Hood. And like Washington, loaded with water and loaded with mountains. And they both share the Columbia River. dammed all the way up as far as it can go, but it's still littered with things. One of my favorite places, I used to live not far from here, Multnomah, Oneota Falls, unbelievable place to walk and hike. And there's a waterfalls at the very end, Fairy Falls, and then Sililo Falls, which was a very sacred place because this is where all the local Indians came down to catch the salmon. This was a major place that Lewis and Clark could not pass. They had to make deals and help the Indians, help them carry their canoes and so on around it. But this eventually was flooded out in 1957. Many of the mountains are sacred, of course, and so are certain lakes within the mountains. You may not know the Wallowas. They're in the eastern, northeastern corner of Oregon. You see this beautiful, almost looks like the east side of the Sierra Nevada, this beautiful lateral moraine coming out. This is Wallowa Lake, a very important sacred spot. And the local Indians actually recently spent a lot of money to build a powwow grounds, and they have a Temalclick celebration every year in July, and it goes for several days. They dance, they drum, they keep their traditions alive. They have contests for the kids to learn not only to do the dances, but also crafts. So they're very friendly and welcoming. It's best, they all just camp out. It's fun to meet people that you haven't seen for a year. Traditionally, these things were times when people traded, but also they are times when marriages were arranged and so on. And so people brought their extra horses if they wanted to find a bride. I always take shells and that I pick up on my travels that people are very appreciative, in abalone when I go, and other things that I can't mention, like whiskers, animal whiskers. Oregon, of course, is a very scenic place, and all of these places which move us, moved them, and there were lots of retreats here. And as well, this is a great, campsite for a village that would sometimes come from the Willamette Valley. They would come over the mountains and set up a spring and fall camp here for the salmon, and then go back into the valley for the winter. This is the Nez Perce Visitor Center. And it's also part of the historical preserve, which extends into Idaho, but it is a very nice place because it's on the river. In this case, it's the Snake River, but it's a very interesting place to visit. Sometimes there's celebrations there. And along the Snake is Buffalo Eddy, which very rich. And it's not far from the place that Chief Joseph took the Nez Perce across as they were fleeing, and tried to make it up to Canada, but they were caught and eventually brought back, which is a fascinating story. In the central part of Oregon is Fort Rock, which is a broken down old volcano, and a site for obsidian, which is very important, and it was traded, but it was occupied for a long time. And these sandals were found not too long ago there, and they were some of the oldest weaving that was ever found in the United States. And now people are beginning to look at these sandals and look at the style and actually try to figure out migration patterns from all the sandals that were collected in Southwest, and then in Alaska, and then also in Asia. By the way, a friend of mine went into the North Arizona Museum. He worked there for a little while, and he saw a remarkable pair of sandals woven, and he copied the design, and then he began to make them out of rubber, and he called it Chaco. So in Tevas, I can tell you that story, but that's another story. This is the Warm Springs Indian Reservation near Fort Rock. It's in central Oregon. They have powwows here. The reservation was sacred to them, which is how they got it. And but Many of the other sacred spots are up in the Cascades or out in the desert, and they're public lands. They too have a very big powwow, which you can see how people just come and set up teepees. And it's a way to strut your stuff. It has always been a way to strut your stuff, but it's a way of keeping your tradition alive. And again, this is a website. It's very simple. Put powwows.com and look at them all over the place. And even down in Florida. And you see all of these all along the West Coast, and they are intertribal, and they're based so that you can go from one to the other. I have friends who are sort of professional dancers, and they go for prizes and also sometimes money. So you can see this one. Yeah, I'm going to the Oxnard powwow. What's wrong with that? Of course, the most sacred place, and one of the interesting things, the only national park in Oregon, which with all of its great beauty, there's only one national park. Unfortunately, it's this, which Crater Lake has always been highly significant spiritually as a place for vision quest and some obsidian collecting. One of the interesting things about it, since the late 1800s, there's been this cedar tree, which is something like 40 feet long, and it's a deadhead. That means that it's been soaked so that it floats upright in the water, and it just floats around. The last time I was there, it's still there. Of course, California. How can you talk about anything in California without mentioning Indians? It's just every place and so many different Indians. This is Lassen, if you don't know this. This is from the east side, Sapphire Lake. And so many tribes. How many tribes? 500 distinct sub-tribes, meaning so different they actually spoke different dialects. There were over 100 different languages, which is greater than the rest of the United States combined. And it didn't take long before, say one group of Southern Miwoks had a different dialect than the Northern group, and slightly different kinds of lifestyles. There was a sort of distinct coastal group and then Central Valley group that often migrated up into the Sierra, and then a very odd group of different people in the South. It may sound strange that there are over 500 tribes, but only 109 federally recognized. It takes a federal act to recognize a tribe, and there are many trying to get federal recognition. And it's interesting, when you get your census form, there is a Native American box you can check. And it's amazing how many people check that. Secretly, we would love to be Native American, and everyone seems to claim some sort of Cherokee grandmother and so on. It's not possible, but nonetheless, there are times when the census comes out, you get these ridiculous figures of who is Native American. There is a federally recognized tribal role, and that is like 1/10 of what the number is that people claim to be Indian. Shasta, it has to be Shasta. Shasta is so remarkable, partly because of what it does to the weather. It sticks up so much, it gets so much high wind, and people say, obviously, this has got to be one of the strongest vortexes in America. Look at it. There's the vortex. You can see it. Those are called lenticular clouds. That means the upper atmosphere is moving. It means there's a change in the weather, that a low pressure is coming. I hate to ruin so much, but nonetheless, okay, that's an alien spaceship coming because it needs to take so many of those spiritual seekers away to their bliss. This was owned, well, it wasn't owned, but various tribes like the Wintu and the Klamath and the McLeod people and the Pitt River people and Modocs all had access to it and certain rights. So there are still native traditions that come here and use it. The Wintu in particular have been very, very active politically. That's what it takes to kind of check things out, because this mountain is overrun with fern fondling, crystal licking hippies that just, I have spent half a lifetime taking people up there mountain climbing, and I've seen it basically gets submerged by different groups. Now there's a pyramid at the base on private land that you can go in and get the Oregon energy concentrated. And of course now mazes and so on, all kinds of retreats. So many came that one of the more sacred places, Panther Meadow Spring, was actually destroyed and trampled. The meadow going across this it's a big artesian spring, and the spring would come up. Eventually the Forest Service, under the prodding of the Wintu and Colleen, who's the tribe, the chief, they refurbished it with the permission. But nonetheless, the spiritual retreaters came and they collect the water and so on. All sorts of things, especially if you, if you need individualized intensive work, you can come here. It is one of the main vortexes you can see here. This is all the listings, Sedona, all the listing of vortexes. And if you get good, you can actually transport yourself from one to the other. But it is a spiritual, sacred place, and it is marvelous to be up on the top. And you get the feeling, partially from the thin air. Why are mountains sacred all over? Well, they're closest to the sky. They're closest to the sky spirits, to the creators. They also make your brain work on little oxygen, and so you access different kind of limbic parts of your brain, and you feel differently up there. And you're sometimes very close to death, and that heightens everything. I hate to analyze all this, but I've had so many experiences up in high mountains all over the world. One of my favorite places is Heart Lake, which is across the valley and looks at it, and most people don't know about Heart Lake or Castle Summit or some of the other lakes. The native Wintu and Pit River people believed that the mountain was so strong that if you just had rocks that could be in sight of the mountain, they would pick up some of the energy. And this day, people practice this by taking crystals and candles and all sorts of bizarre things up there and leaving it for a while to absorb the energy and then take it back to their own altar. Also near this was a very important lake called Medicine Lake, and medicine refers to, of course, your spiritual strength and your spiritual helpers. And near Medicine Lake is this volcanic cone and obsidian flow. So this was very potent because you could get materials to trade, and these things were traded all over the place. Around the corner from Shasta are a number of hot springs. Unfortunately, these used to be Indian, but they were bought up or stolen. So they're all commercialized, but nonetheless, they're still fun to kind of patronize, at least when you have a chance. But all hot springs and geysers were sacred because they were so rare. And of course, purification was very important. So these are a number of them up and down the Siskiyou area. Likewise, caves were an access to the underworld and the spirits of the underworld. So there are lava tubes, not technically caves, but since Shasta is completely volcanic, there are a lot of lava tubes, and this one happens to be on Forest Service, highly vandalized, but nonetheless it's there. And of course, there's another commercial operation. There's several. This is Lake Shasta Caverns, fun to go into because it is classic. One of the few big caverns we have We don't have much limestone, some in the Sierra Nevada and the Marble Mountains, but this is a very unusual little isolated, uh, beautiful cavern development, which was sacred. There's some other nearby sacred ones that are a little bit difficult to get into. This one's in Shasta County called the Grizzly Bear Cave. And actually Pleistocene mammals have been taken out of this, including very large grizzly bears. Now this is Shasta, huge watershed, and one of the rivers that I want to talk about is the McCloud River. Another one is the very important Pitt River, and the Pitt River wanders quite a ways. And then these all come together into the what used to be called the uh, Sacramento River, but it has now been dammed so many times it's hard to know what is river and what isn't. The McCloud is really a sacred place. Waterfalls, this is the upper waterfalls, these are the lower waterfalls. The upper waterfalls, or the lower river, is really important because it didn't take much for the white miners and so on to realize there's a lot of fish here. So some of this got back to the Smithsonian, and Spencer Baird, who was an early biologist, came out here and saw how many fish were in the McCloud and Pitt River, built a hatchery, and this is called the Baird Hatchery. He hired some of the Indians at first to help them collect and milk the fish. Later, they just shot the Indians. But one of the things they took out of this river, rainbow trout. And rainbow trout had been spread all over the world, and every rainbow trout owes its existence to the McCloud River. Yet the Indians cannot get access to fishing rights in many cases. They asked the Forest Service to close it down so they could hold a coming of age ceremony without the boats coming up, and the Forest Service refused the permit. This is what is this? I forget the name of this spring, but it's in the lower part, a wonderful place to kayak into. The Hoopa and the Yurok and the Klamath and the Wintu decided to do something different. Since they couldn't do it on the McCloud, they decided to go after the Klamath River. This is a remarkable river, like Shasta, in a way that there's a big dam up here and then several dams, and this is a big water area and power area. So they have been trying to get these dams removed so the salmon can run as they used to all the way to the headwaters. One way is to, what they're trying now is to say, should rivers be considered people? In legalese, should rivers have standing? Now that may sound silly to you, but very sophisticated lawyers recently convinced everyone that corporations are people. So if a corporation can become a person legally and have legal rights, why can't a river? Why can't a tree have standing? We'll see how well they do with this. Anyway, the spiritual practices, which are varied throughout, but also you have to think of what is going on. The songs and dances are important to maintain balance and to show the universe that you appreciate it and that you're worthy of the balance. And you purify and cleanse and fast, which fasting was always very, very common. Other rituals and prayers and offerings so that you can appease and show your appreciation. And then you had amulets, spiritual helpers, and we've talked about spirit quests. Many times there were public ceremonies so that the spirits could see them. Sometimes there were very private ones. And there were sacred plants, and this is pretty much universal across the United States. The various species vary, sage, cedar, or juniper, depending, tobacco, and sweetgrass. And smoking was a sacred thing. You smoked sometimes a mixture of this, and you made little prayer bundles and prayer ties that you would put all of these in and leave them as offerings and prayers to the spirits. Uh, Tobacco is sacred, and it was used to connect people. Interestingly, a number of tribes have been trying to go with this interesting thing that tobacco is sacred. It's not to be smoked haphazardly, because Indians smoke like crazy, and they're dying of lung cancer and emphysema and so on. So there's a move to get young people to use tobacco to make these prayer bundles, and not smoke. So the smoke would carry prayers, absorb the prayer, and carry them to the spirits. And it's a way of honoring, it's a way of passing blessings and so on. And so they're trying to get people not to smoke and use it just as ritual thing. A movie was made by this woman, I forget, I think she's Navajo, Dene, and this was not 1917, 2017, sorry. This was put on PBS, and they've been starting with the kids, having them make sacred bundles, and it seems to be working. Of course, dances and songs. We don't dance enough. We don't sing enough, especially as groups. Sometimes there were secret societies based around a particular initiation, a particular ceremony. Kutsu is a very widespread group of secret societies. They required a fair amount of wealth to be able to afford this regalia and these costumes and any pendants. They became spirits who would visit. They take on the spiritual nature, visit the village, and then bless it, and had various functions. And often they had a big roundhouse that sometimes the dance would take place inside the roundhouse itself. They were often called big heads because they had these remarkable headdresses. By the way, that feathered headdress is a Plains Indian phenomenon, and it didn't occur anywhere basically in California. Indians are great copiers. They'll adopt something from another tribe without batting an eye. These were an early indication of the big heads. This was a dance group. And there are different dances that the Kutsu would do. A brush dance was a healing, especially for children. The jump dance was to maintain balance. The white deerskin dance was to give thanks and renewal to all the animals. Every animal had its specific dance to thank them. And I love this. Even the little tiny brown creeper had its own dance. The dancers had a special basket called the Kutsu jump dance basket. It was used all the time, and it had their secret and the sacred amulets and other things that gave their power from their spirit guide. And you can see them down here. These are highly prized. And these were woven, and a lot of taboo about if someone else wove it and gave it to you, you could never give it back. In fact, they couldn't even touch it. Decoration was limited, but one thing that was around were red shafted flickers. And they are woodpeckers that are on the ground, tend to eat a lot of ants, get carotenoids in their body, and use it to decorate, color their feathers. And these feathers were used extensively. So when you see these headdresses, those are flicker feathers, carefully woven in. So you can imagine how many flickers gave their wings for this, just a single. And you can see the baskets here, shells and whatnot. Here is a brush healing dance by Hupas, which is, say, way north of Mendocino County, a Yurok jump dance for balance. Here's the white deerskin dance, a very powerful one. They carefully cleansed the skin completely, and this was a prized, powerful possession, and also had a distinctive headdress if they for the chiefs. This was one of the secret societies. You had to be initiated into it. You had to learn the traditions. You had to learn the steps and the songs. And it was quite a lifelong tradition. One of the favorite decorations, and you've seen lots and lots of pictures of this, it's a tiny snail that has a linear shell and it buries in the mud. And it basically is along the northwest coast. That's the only place you'll find this particular species. And Tlingit and Haida and Salish would go out in their canoes, have a long pole, as long as they could get, had a brush and some weight, and they would move it around and try to capture them. It is not easy to do, let me tell you, especially if this is a 40-foot pole to get these things. These were then one of the most prized trade items anywhere in North America. And they have been found actually in New York, but all the way down along the coast of California, all the way across the central, you could buy a bride with one of these shells. It took 5 for a horse, but it's easy to get, a bride. So think how many brides you can have. And you show, this is a wedding dress. You show how wealthy you are. And here's, of course, abalone. That would be traded. Abalone, we know, made it all the way up into the mound culture of the Mississippi Valley. So these are tusk shells or dentalium. And this is part of the trade system. And prior to powwow, and what powwow means is actually a rendezvous. The French trappers gave the name because they would show up and trade for beaver skins and mink skins and so on at these rendezvous. And it would happen periodically, huge rendezvous that was, people couldn't kill each other, but they could get married. And there's traditional areas where these happened all along, and say the Missouri River and up along the Columbia River, right at the entrance into the Columbia Gorge. So this is one of the trade routes. And then of course it went down to Chaco. From here it went down to the mound. So there were specialized traders. They got infiltrated. When I talk about the trappers, there was a big trapping group here that would come all the way across and then come up here into the Pitt River, and there would be a big Pitt Modoc rendezvous with the traders, and the British would come down likewise and join them. So there were a lot of people moving around in the early 1700s, trading items and so on. These were the native local trade routes. And if you look at this kind of squinting, you'd say, oh, those are the highways. Yes. Where do we get the idea of putting the highways through Sonora Pass and Carson Pass and so on? Well, these were trade routes. And what was brought, and this was a very famous trade route. I was going to talk a long time about this, but it follows the Mojave River, and then it goes through the central part and down to Flagstaff. Padre Garces, who was the first white person to come into Southern California by way of Mexico, he met 2 Chumash runners who just stopped, stared at him, and then kept running. They would run this route. Likewise, this is Mono Pass, which was a very arduous task. This was one of the ways that obsidian came from Obsidian Dome and Mono craters and came across. The Paiutes replicate this hike. I've been on it a couple times and felt very privileged to join them on this. Here's dentalium again in wedding dresses. Olivella shells. Just realized I had these. I don't know if you probably can't see them. Anyway, there's olivella shells here. They would be broken down and then carved into beads. People who were the traders would have tattoos on their arms, their wrist, and up in their forearms. And that's how you measured the money. You stretched out this and to see how long it was. And these were highly traded. You'll find them all over the West. And a very careful drill that was made to cut into the shell. This is interesting. This is a Haida carving, but it was found in Los Angeles in a Chumash dig. Now, Chumash were too smart to go up to Haida and Tlingit, but the Tlingit came down on slaving raids. So we don't know how they got this, but and it's pre-contact. So some of the Alaskan Indians and British Columbia Indians came all the way down to Southern California, maybe to learn surfing. One of the other traditions, of course, is the Temescal. It's a word you probably have heard, but it is the local version of the sweat lodge. Sometimes just a very quick put up, sometimes mudded over, sometimes cedar or redwood plank. And this was very important. Sometimes people had these right on the adjoining their house, but you would wipe off the sweat and put sage on this, and often had chanting. It was a purification. Native Americans pretty much bathed every day too, so that was part of purification. They had these roundhouses, which were secret ceremony groupings, and often would have dances inside. And this is a remarkable painting, and this was made, I think this is one of Remington's. Just an amazing thing. This is subterranean in part. We tend to think that sport is frivolous. If you see, well, it may be frivolous, but think how many people love it and miss it. But Native Americans were passionate and saw it as a religion, and they invented several games. This, of course, has a little stick with a little kind of net, and you would toss a ball back and forth. They call it the creator's game. They said the creator gave us this game to spiritually purify us and to maintain our balance. It's interesting to see the evolution of the lacrosse stick. Until now, they're fiberglass and so on. But the original one was very, very tiny. And so was the ball. You teach the kids, oh, this actually is a hoop game. See, he's tossing this to his kid. But this is fun to watch. People play the old version of lacrosse and barefooted usually. And boy, this is still a pretty hefty stick. Crazy games that would go on for days, and the field would be 300 yards long. Of course, now the net got bigger and bigger, but they still use moccasins in any way. And then very, very, you start young, you play all your life, and it's a great thing for camaraderie and for kind of bonding. And there's a version of it that probably is older than lacrosse, and it's just simply a ball and a specialized curved stick. They would heat it, or they would look for branches that had this curve on it. And they would just, they didn't even have boundaries. They just decide where the goal was, and they would just run and run until they dropped. And shinny is still played. And this is the purest form of the game. Here's a tournament that was up in Fort Mendocino. You see the kids play barefoot. There's a version of this where the balls are not balls. They are tied together with rawhide. And the kid runs around, finally drops them, and then you try to get that and either throw it on top of this or over it. It's still called shinny. Here's a couple of groups. This is from Utah. This is Papago, and they would have meetings. This is a version where the balls are tethered, and you did the same thing, toss them. So it would go on in days, and it was very ritualistic. Chunky, which I mentioned in relationship to the mound culture. You can see one of the mound figures here. It was practiced even in the West. A little basket or this disc, and you then threw threw your spear to see if you could hit it or get as close as possible. It's sort of like a moving bocce. So here's one where you could actually get it through, and big playing fields. All these villages had big playing fields. Don't really want to talk about burials because many of the Native American or California Indians actually cremated. But when there was burial, most of the women would self-mutilate and cut their hair off and so on. And then you didn't mention the name of that person again. Games, they are fanatics about games. They will play anything and they'll bet on anything. I think it's ironic that they finally have gotten their revenge with casinos. But you notice the little 6-shooter right there next to the card game. They didn't need cards. They had their own games. Some of these are just hiding games. That is, you would hide something behind your back and they would have to guess. Sometimes you would pass it from person to person. You would guess who had it. But these were versions of cards. And there could be quite a lot of cards, by the way. And another game that was called the bowl and dice. And one of these was also a hidden game. You see the women are very, very concentrating on it. And you can just play this with kids. You just make your own version of it. And of course, very few landscapes like this anywhere in the United States. This is unique. And we have so many oaks. And this provided the main bread of Native Californians, acorns. It is sometimes called a balanophagus diet because acorns were gathered, they were dried, they were cut, they were mashed. And it was a very long and tedious procedure. You would hull them, dry them, grind them, and then soak them. And this soaking was important to get the tannic acid out of it. Eventually, then you keep soaking it and then you would heat it. And you heat it in a basket by putting hot rocks in it. And then you would stir the rock until the mash or the pinole, the name you probably have heard, the pinole is hot. To do this, they had tremendous number of baskets and they were the most fantastic basket weavers. In fact, they did not know pottery. In part, it's not their fault. They didn't contact most of the Indians who knew how to make pottery, the Southwesterns in particular, and there's very little clay. There's one area I own on 88 that actually makes porcelain, but that requires high heating. So baskets were used for everything, including cooking with hot stones. And so the basket would get burned. But they were very proud of their baskets. And they knew which acorn to eat. They knew the amount of protein was very, very high in coast live oak and very, very high in valley oak. So they were very partial in this. So harvest, sun drying, cracking, sieving, soaking, settling, and then cooking. They also took horse chestnuts, but boy, that has some high levels of tannin and took a lot of soaking with ash and kneading and then settling and soaking and so on. That was a bad year food. So this was a long process. Here it is better. You see laying it out. Sometimes you did this in a stream and let the water just wash, or you just had someone pouring water over it. Eventually you would take out the dry acorn and cook it. Sometimes you had a big setup and you would make bread or a soup. The soup, as I mentioned, was called pinole. Anyone who ate this bread would generally grind their teeth down because you see all the gravel and stuff that's still left on this flour. And that was an indicator that you had eaten a lot of bread. Off of Highway 88, just past Jackson is a remarkable place. You just take a little side road down Daffodil Hill and you go to Chauncey Indian Grinding Rock State Park. And it is a remarkable place. It has one of the largest granite outcrops in the lower foothills, and it is just covered with grinding holes. It also has a replica of a roundhouse, and then what the Miwok houses were like. It has a little museum. It's closed at the moment. Yes, I just was up there. Uh, and but it is remarkable to see this. The museum is worthwhile. They have a powwow every fall when they collect it, and they play stick games. They play shinny, and it's amazing to watch them. I've played it with them. Baskets, remarkable, just collector's items. Uh, all kinds of baskets, collecting baskets, carrying baskets, not the papoose. This was actually kind of like a Swedish design. This was both a papoose, a cradle, and a carrying basket. You see them sitting in there? Well, you didn't have to carry it on your back. You just picked it up. There's a handle and had an actual shade, or you could put it on the ground and rock it. Also, baskets for hats. Baskets, you walk along and beat the seeds into a basket with a beater. So these were remarkable basket makers and remarkable baskets. The cradles are distinct to California. You find no other basket or cradle like this. You'll find papooses. Another thing, the coastal Indians were, of course, salmon people. And it was a big event to welcome the first salmon back. The first salmon caught was filleted and then returned to the river in a very important ceremony that included dancing and then letting it go back to the river, blessing the water and so on. Fishing rights are still fought all over the place. This is Klamath. Attempts to see if they can use their old fishing methods and fish in their old places. And the states or the Fish and Wildlife are constantly thwarting them in their efforts. They've gotten smart, or Amy's gotten smart. She's a Yurok up in McKinleyville. She worked on some of these fish and wildlife counts, and she saw some of the problems. She went back to the University of Oregon, got her law degree, and is now a tribal lawyer. And she's constantly fighting the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Annihilation, as I call it, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service and all the bureaucracy to try to get rights back. They do have a salmon festival all up and down the coast. This is another powwow, starting with about northern Humboldt County. There's a salmon festival, a salmon welcome, and they're trying very hard to get the Klamath River undammed so that the salmon can run as the way they used to. In Sacramento, inside a state park is another state park. It's the State Museum, the State Indian Museum. So if you ever get to Sacramento and you don't know what to do, there are a lot of good pubs, but this is well worth a visit. It's actually open at the moment. They take a limited number of people in, and it is one of the best collections. It's diverse. And one of the things our governor said recently that he's allocating more money to rebuild this because he felt, as many people do, that this is almost a pathetic kind of place to show how intensely diverse and interesting the native population of California is. And so they're rebuilding this. I'm not sure where it's going to be. This is a very strange place. It's an old, how you call it in your language, he was from Sweden, I think. He built this ski manor out in Antelope Valley, but and a long time ago, over 100 years ago, he became enamored of native populations, and he filled the inside of this with his private collection. So this is the Antelope Valley Indian Museum, very eccentric. I have a small version of it myself, but that's all right. The Oakland Museum is an excellent place. I don't know if it's open at the moment, but has one of the best basket collections. They spent most of their money in acquiring these modern versions of baskets. It's also a fabulous natural history museum. And if you've ever read Elna Bacher's island called California, it was based on the museum, or they went hand in hand, because the museum is set up as a cross section of California. But pomos, these were wedding baskets, and these are top notches from quail. And they were woven in along with olivella beads, and then woodpeckers and magpies and so on. Unbelievable ability. We do have some of these in our Monterey museum down in the harbor. Sorry. One of the greatest expanses of habitat, of course, in the California is the one you can't find anymore. The whole of the San Joaquin and Sacramento Valley was a marshland, unbelievable duck factory, water everywhere, rivers flowing, fresh water, remarkable, and it's pretty much all gone. And we can thank California was amazingly inventive. One of the things that came out of the Central Valley was jacuzzi and Berkeley pumps to pump the water out. And then the other two big things that came out was a company founded by the Holt brothers in Stockton called Caterpillar. And they perfected not only the bulldozer, which has changed the face of our planet, but also taking something that used to be called the Fresno scraper and making it into a road grader to flatten this. So at one time, this is the San Joaquin Valley, Fresno is up here, but there was not only marsh, all of this was marsh, but there was a massive lake, Tulare Lake, and then another lake down here, Goose Lake, and then another lake, Buena Vista Lake, and another lake, Kern Lake. So this is the first satellite map made in 1851 by the Vortex flyers from Mount Shasta. No, this is what a satellite map would have looked like with Buena Vista Lake and Tulare, or Tulare Lake, Buena Vista, and Bakersfield, Kern Lake, and all these rivers coming in. Of course, what we did was we took these rivers and channeled them and piped them up this way into the San Joaquin River, and these eventually dried up. And then people like Miller bought these, and Boswell, and these became the biggest cotton places on the planet. 1968, I want to say, we had such a heavy winter that both Buena Vista and Tulare Lake actually began to fill. And you may notice this particular canoe. This is made out of tules. And you tie a bundle together, and then you bundle another and another, and they're very, well, not seaworthy, but they are pond worthy. Although I've paddled one across with some friends across the San Francisco Bay. They take forever to make, but they're sort of fun. And what was this like? I think about right now, I'd love to be up in Klamath Lake, because this I took up in Klamath Lake a couple of Thanksgivings ago. These are snow geese flying. Oh, there it is. There's the boat going across San Francisco. It eventually gets really waterlogged and bends in half. But anyway, you can make them for a single person. These are snow geese, again, up in Klamath Lake. When Klamath Lake freezes, they jump over Shasta and come down to Gray Lodge, and then they come down to Merced Wildlife Refuge, and then they head on south. And then, of course, sandhill cranes do the same. We do have a sandhill crane festival every year in Lodi, by the way, and you're guaranteed to see them, not 50,000 like you might down in southern Arizona, but that's all right. Nearby, if you go down the San Luis Obispo and turn whatever it is, Highway 56 or 58, and then turn south, there is a national monument, Carrizo Plain. This rock is now fenced. I think it's closed right now, but it's about to open, and you have to call them or find them on the website. This is an outcropping, a very unique outcropping that the Alones and the Costanoans used remarkable painting, which is pigment done, and 2 different colors, in some cases 3 different colors. So it's also just a beautiful place to visit, especially in March and April. It will go off like very few places. There are pronghorn and kit foxes and coyotes and bobcat. It's a big area. You can camp almost anywhere, but you can easily get lost too. And this is Carrizo Plain, and this is what Carrizo looks like. It does fill up after the winter rains, and this is an important area for both sandhills and snow geese. And it is a moody, interesting place that most people don't know about. Morro Rock was long a sacred site, and as a sacred site, of course, the Indians are now prohibited from using it. Continuing battle to try to get access to sacred areas. It's also partly sacred because, federally sacred because of the peregrine falcons that nest up there. All of the morros, all of the big rocks around that area, and there's several old volcanic necks, were sacred. This is a view of Morro Bay that most people don't see. And then we talk about the Chumash, and I'll try to finish up. The Chumash are really bizarre. They, it has to do, I'm convinced, with La La Land. They were different. They had beginnings of a hierarchy. They were more like the Mound people, so they had elites, they had priests, they had hierarchical organization. They were cantankerous and very belligerent at times. They did have a couple of uprisings against the early missions, bless their hearts. They also occupied and traded and fished out on the Channel Islands. They too had their big head forms of secret societies, but they also had this priesthood system. Very ornately woven kind of huts, sometimes really big. This is actually a tribal center right behind Malibu. You can look it up, and they do have a big powwow and dancing right at this place. What's also unique about them is they developed some technologies that no one else had. One of them is they had a plank and sewn canoe called a tamal. And these were redwood mostly, as you can see in this case. They were redwood driftwoods that would come down from Monterey County and farther north, because there were no redwoods down here. They could plank them really easily because redwood will actually come apart as planks, and you can shave them down, sew them, they're sewn together, then you pitch them. And the pitch, they would go out in the channel and find the pitch floating, and they'd melt it and pitch it. A number of these survived, they're remade, and there's probably a canoe chief. Each canoe had a team of paddlers and sort of a headman in this. And they would take these all up and down around Concepcion, which they're trying to get dedicated as a sacred area, go all the way down to Baja. They'd go out to the Channel Islands, Santa Cruz, and there's evidence they made it all the way out to Miguel, which is quite a ways. And Miguel is the Isle of the Blue Dolphins. They traded they would trade for abalone, fish, sharks, all sorts of things, but they traded these steatite, remarkable effigies. And these effigies were also part of the individual power that people had from vision quests, but these also were trade items. The remarkable, the steatite itself came from the Channel Islands, from Santa Cruz. They were also one of the prominent users of datura, called momoi. And datura, as I mentioned, was used as a trance inducer. Mostly they were made into teas by the roots. a single seed could be very, very dangerous and deadly. This later was spread up and down the coast, but mostly it's the Chumash that used the sacred datura. Okay, get this there. And maybe because of the datura, they were remarkably creative in their artwork. There are a couple of fabulous caves that are near the Siming Hills that are actually you can make access to. Oh. Along with the Chumash were there a whole group of very unique Indians, and some of the border Indians like the Mojaves and the Chimoeves, and down here was actually Quechuan. These are different language groups, and they had almost no association with the Gabrielino or the Cahuilla. They were actually sort of Ute and Navajo languages. Also, the Chimoeve along the and the Papago were very prevalent in they had villages of two-spirit people. And two-spirit people are found all over native traditions. They were called Berdache. That is, they were men who dressed as women and acted like women and did women things. Some Native Americans believe there were 5 spirits, that there could be 5 genders. But anyway, this is a well-known phenomenon. And the Chimoeve were distinct in that they had villages that welcomed Berdache, and that the Chimoeve themselves maintained these villages. And the Berdache were very often healers and shaman because they had 2 spirits rather than 1 spirit. This is a place up near Bishop that's looking at Mount Tom, and this is on the tablelands, a remarkable series of petroglyphs. The tablelands were sacred. It overlooked the Owens River and the Owens Valley, which was a sacred area for agriculture. Not well known and very puzzling in terms of their use. This is the 13th moon rock, and I think this is a calendar because they used 13 moons to count. Some of these are isolated. This is in the middle of the Chimoeve Valley, which is along the Colorado River. And this was an old village site. And no, it doesn't look like much. It looks like maybe a burro slept there. Sometimes you can actually find these ancient trails. And this is not a deer trail. This is an ancient Chimoeve trail. And that is actually Lake Havasu in the background. And this is a man, a Chimoeve, who's a descendant in the sheep clan and caretaker of some of these rocks. One of the most remarkable artifact, if you will, the traders who came from the coast down the San Bernardino Mountains, ran along the Mojave River, across the Mojave Desert to Fort Yuma, and then down, would purify themselves on the way out by running through this maze. And this is an aerial view showing you all the mazes that were here. And of course, in our wisdom, we just bulldozed the heck out of these when we were building the interstate. No idea what was here. This was before Caltrans had archaeologists. So this is one of the last standing segments of it, the Topak Maze. In a very spiritual place, because these traders would go on to New Mexico, and then they would come back and they would purify themselves by running through the maze again. Just far, a little bit south along the Colorado River are what's left of a whole series of incredible intaligos or geoglyphs. The rocks would be moved to expose the soft pinkish soil underneath, and we don't know what these were for. Most of them were destroyed. The BLM actually were very proud of these when they were trying to figure out what to do with the worthless desert. And so they told people about them. And of course, everybody, if they go anywhere in the desert, have to drive an ATV or a motorcycle or something. And so, of course, all of these places got trashed. And then they finally got smart and put up a fence, but the fences are too small. This is on China Lake Naval Weapons Center, which is the most concentrated and most bizarre petroglyphs anywhere in the United States. They are remarkable. They are old. They run the gamut from probably 2000 BC up to 1000 AD. This is my good friend Lenny, who is a sculptor, and he's doing a series of metal pieces for me like this. I mentioned to go to these places, you have to go to the Matarunga Valley Museum and sign up for a tour, and you can take a little tour up here. Now, we tend to think that the Indians stopped at the border, but there were a whole series of Indians just as diverse, the Cochimi, the Guayacura, and the Piracu. They were all very, very different languages. They had both cold water and warm water, mountains with bighorn sheep and deer. So they were very, very content. They had lots to eat. And they were among the most phenomenal painters. And this is all with hematite and iron oxides. These are painted, they're quite large. They're painted on walls in the southern part. You can get an idea. And some don't know how they got up there to paint these. This is a museum in Bahia de Los Angeles, which shows a nearby painting of the giant serpent. So go find a road, especially one where there's no pavement. Go out and commune. This particular spot is very near the Bishop petroglyphs and also near hot springs and a very sacred spot, the White Mountain Peak up here.